All right, welcome to our next part of our session 3. We will be covering a lot in this session, so get ready to hold on to your hats. You got a lot to cover. So today we're going to discuss the interwar years from 1919 to 1939. So the interwar years, how did people see their post-war world? Basically, they survived the First World War. What did they see after this war? You're talking about 10 million killed, so it really changed their view of the world. How did you come out of this war? You have the victors and the Allies, and you have the losers being, well, basically the Germans, since they were punished for the war, and Austria-Hungary was broken up, and all of these empires fell apart. Well, not all of them. A lot of the losing side empires broke up. How do you prepare for the next war? And how do you prevent another war? These were all a lot of the questions being asked during this time. So the treaties, we talked about the Treaty of Versailles. Also, there was a lot of other treaties that came out of the 1919 Peace Conference. There were the Treaty of Versailles, Arms Limitation Agreements, the Washington Naval Conference of 1921 and 22, trying to control the size of navies, and the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. So the Treaty of Versailles dealt with Germany. Germany started the war, therefore they should pay for the war. And the Allies wanted to be very harsh on the Germans. Now, not all of the Allies. Actually, Wilson wanted to be fairly good to the Germans, not punish them as much as the other Allied powers did, like the British and the French. The way the Treaty of Versailles was looked at, it looked back, because the French were now in the driver's seat, so they looked back on it and remembered the way the Prussians punished them after the Franco-Prussian War, and also looking back on what happened at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. It was very harsh on the Russians, took a lot of territory away from the Russians. That got the Russians out of the war in 1917. So the Treaty of Versailles disarms the Germans. The European allies, the British and the French, wanted to cripple German power. They feared it because throughout the late 19th and early 20th century, France and Germany feared this rise of Great Britain, or the rise of Germany. Germany was building like a huge navy. They were looking to expand their empire. Also, if the Germans had this huge navy, the British basically ruled the seas, then the Germans could actually, hurt Britain, because most of its imperial power, its colonial power, was overseas, and that's why they had to have such a huge navy. So now, with the Allies being the victors, they could settle the scores that they had with the Germans. So the Washington Naval Conference was discussing limit the size of militaries. It also addressed some rising powers, Japan, China, and Asia. The British were worried about the rise of Japan and its territorial ambitions. We touched on it very briefly when we talked about President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, winning the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating the end of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. Quick Reader's Digest view of that. The Russo-Japanese War was a war where Japan was looking to expand its imperial holdings and came in direct conflict with the Russians. And turns out that they beat the Russians, and this was the first time that an Eastern power, which is Japan, actually defeated a Western power, which was the Russians. Another thing that worried them was that basically when Japan was opened in 1850s by the Americans, there was two different ways that the Japanese saw this. They saw what the Europeans were doing in China. Basically, they were creating spheres of influence in China, Japan decided they did not want to be chopped into pieces like China. So in order to basically hold off the West, they had to become the West. So they basically had the Western powers like Britain, France, and the European powers teach them how to make ships and become industrial and build a modern army. So basically, Japan was created by the West, and then when they started to have imperial ambitions like the West, the European powers and the United States were like, well, you can't do that. You're not like us. You're little yellow people. And once again, going back to social Darwinism, so they had this great fear that while empires were being built for British, French, and the Americans, that the Japanese were going to hone in on their cut of the pie, and they did not really like that. So the members of the conference were Great Britain, the United States, Japan, Italy, and France. So the Washington Naval Conference basically limited the size of the ships in the navies, tonnage, and gun calibers. So the more tonnage you had, the more armor you had, the more firepower you had. So gun caliber, basically you have bigger guns. You have different classes of ships like battleships and cruisers. But at this time, the main force within the navies was the battleship. So that's where it concerned the Washington Naval Conference. The Great Britain and United States get 5 tons for their capital ships. Basically, they get the big ones. The Japanese get 3 tons, and Italy and France get 1.75 tons for their capital ships. So what that means is that the United States and Great Britain could build these huge ships, while the Japanese, the Italians, and French could build ships, but not quite as big as the British and the Americans. This did not make the Japanese very happy. They feared the United States and Britain would eventually join together to fight Japan. And at this time, Japan was outnumbered 10-3 with the Allies, who they were a part of during World War I. The treaty helps make Japan feel like they're not being treated as equals. Like we said, social Darwinism. How are these little yellow people of Japan basically? And that's the way they thought. These were, they were inferior to the West. They were Asian. How could they challenge empires like Great Britain and France or the United States? So this made Japan feel like they weren't being treated as equals. So one thing that came out of the Washington Naval Conference is that they declared what was called a battleship holiday. Basically, for 10 years, from 22 to 32, no battleships could be built. But that didn't say you couldn't build heavy cruisers. Now, heavy cruisers are not quite battleships, but they're not quite destroyers. So they are just one step below basically a battleship. But they still have very big caliber guns, still have the tonnage, still can do a lot of damage. So you still were building, I guess you could say, small battleships. The Washington Naval Conference is seen as a success. You have the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. This is where Frank Kellogg, the American Secretary of State, and Aristide Briand, the French foreign minister, basically were trying to legislate the end of war. The pact basically said that war would no longer be used to resolve differences. It was first signed by the French, and the United States signed it as well. It was soon joined by others. The pact reflected public opinion at this time. You're talking about tens of millions of men that were killed during the war. So people are like, we have to figure out how not to have another war, how not to go down this path again, where the only way we resolve these conflicts is by military action. So the Kellogg-Briand Pact was one of those ways that we're trying to not use military force to decide problems that were going on in the world. Also, during this time, you have the growing peace lobby. It drew a lot of its ideas from popular culture. You have books that were written by this time called like one All Quiet on the Western Front, which was basically, remembering what it was like to fight in the trenches and see your friends being blown up and gassed and all that from the experiences of World War One. But you also have others that were glorifying war, like Storm of Steel. Storm of Steel wasn't as well known. It was basically a pro-war book talking about the greatness of the Germans. The Nazis loved it, and the Nazis also hated All Quiet on the Western Front because basically they kind of feared what basically All Quiet on the Western Front was very anti-war, so that would kind of cut into what they were trying to do. So that really worried them. So they really didn't like All Quiet on the Western Front. So during this time, after the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was trying to figure out how it's going to rearm itself. So the Treaty of Versailles laid out in its statements that the Germans would not have an air force, but it did allow for a coast guard and a small army. Now, we were talking about this earlier, that the Germans were surrounded by enemies. You had the Russians on their eastern front and the French and the British over on their western front. Now you had all these new countries that were created, like Poland and Czechoslovakia. These were carved out of the old empire of the Russians and the Austro-Hungarians. So once again, these people were now considered enemies. So basically, Germany was trying to figure out how to build up their military once again so they could defend themselves. They were doing this way before the Nazis ever rose to power. So a lot of people figure that the Nazis were the ones that were basically created the German war machine that they went to war with. Actually, it was during the Weimar Republic, the government that predated, basically before Hitler came to power. They were already trying to figure out how to get their military built up before the Nazis even came to power. So getting around the Treaty of Versailles, basically the Germans created reserve units, paramilitary units, to train to a certain point where they weren't trained as an army. So they did have a small standing army, but they had these huge reserve units. They got around not having an air force by creating glider clubs that would train the pilots. They also came up with civil aviation. Basically, German aircraft designers came up with planes to carry passengers and mail, so Lufthansa, the national German airline, was created where they trained these pilots so they could fly. They also figured out that these planes could be, in time of war, converted to bombers. Like I said, this is where they create the German national airline, Lufthansa. And basically, Lufthansa trains pilots, builds aircraft, and works on logistics that you are going to need when you are fighting in a war. So that's going to end it for this section, and we will continue on the next section here. So I'm going to end it here, and we will continue talking about the rearming of Germany in the next section.